KMHD HD2 Gresham, Portland.
A music revolution.
There's an old saying, to the victors belong the spoils.
There's another old saying, Senator. Don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining.
No, stop talking.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I break your concentration?
I'm walking here!
Here's a fact. I don't know whether you know or not.
Anyone?
It's been confusion from the word go.
You know, that's just like your opinion, man.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
The voice said to me, I want you to tell the people the truth. Not an easy thing to do because the people don't want to know the truth. And I said, you're kidding. What the hell should I know about the truth? But the voice said to me, don't worry about the truth. I will put the words in your mouth.
We are the Midnight Sunrise, a show by artists, for artists, covering the ins and outs of the alternative community.
Then taken to a Union-controlled satellite link.
I broadcast my revelation to the 12 states and 4 off-world colonies. 18 minutes later, the enforcers attacked. And so to know thyself is only possible through the eyes of the other. The nature of our immortal lives is in the consequences of our words and deeds that go on apportioning themselves throughout all time. Our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we are bound to others. Past and present. And by each crime and every kindness, we birth our future.
Hi there out there in Radio Land. Welcome to the Midnight Sunrise. I'm your host, Charles Shaw. Tonight's show is called Freedom and Slavery. We're coming to you live from KMHD Portland. And that was a clip from Cloud Atlas, the Wachowski film. Lana Wachowski's almost 2.5-hour epic on freedom and slavery, which will be the topic of our show tonight. We've been gone for a couple of weeks, so we're just going to check in for just a minute and tell you what's been going on. Mike's back in the studio here with us. We are actually back in the studio this evening.
It's great to be live.
So before we get started on everything, Mike went through some crazy stuff lately, so we want to give him a little love here and talk a little bit about what's been going on with our engineer here. Tell him.
Well, just it's health related stuff. I got kind of a pressing surgery that must occur. I'm looking at having a heart valve replacement surgery. So, this is something I was born with. I was diagnosed with this heart valve issue when I was 2. And incidentally, I've come to learn just recently that this is the number one congenital heart defect for men on the planet is bad heart valves, a mitral valve and an aortic valve. So it's been giving me a run through the mill, and it's made me tired and had a run in the hospital. So looking forward to having surgery and getting fixed up by modern medicine.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you back, man. We were
Thanks.
worried about you. And Iris is still in Atlanta.
She is?
Yeah, she's out with some family stuff going on down there. And Mr. Random Rab is down in Costa Rica, probably enjoying himself with his family out on the beach.
Costa Rica.
So we're going to get Andrew Jones on the line. We are just trying to connect with him out there in Colorado, and we'll get started on the show first. So that clip was from Cloud Atlas, and it might be a little difficult to hear what the character was saying. The character's name is Sonmi45, and she's a clone. She's one of 6 storylines that exist in Cloud Atlas. And each of these storylines is about kind of a reincarnated soul, a person who's reborn generation after generation, starting in the colonial slave trade, and then going to the turn of the century in London, and then going to the 1970s in San Francisco, then going to London in 2012, and then going to New Seoul in 2200 in the far future, which is the most interesting storyline, I think, of it. And then there's a last storyline that takes place something like 10,000 years in the future, or 1,000,000 years in the future. And so what the character says, Sunmi, she's a clone, and she's born a slave. And, she was fabricated specifically to work in a fast food restaurant. And she wakes up every day and puts on an outfit and works for 20 hours serving drinks and food to people. And she's given a sack of food stuff and put to sleep in a little rack in the wall. And that's every day of her life, and that's her entire reality. And so her storyline is about her awakening, and her story kind of tells the ongoing story of slavery. And what she says in that quote, which is called Sunyi's Revelation, is to be perceived. And so to know thyself is only possible through the eyes of the other. The nature of our mortal lives is the consequences of our words and deeds that go on and are pushing themselves throughout all time. Our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb we are bound to others, past and present, and by each crime and every kindness we birth our future. So one of the things that we've been trying to, address as our fundamental concept on the show here is this notion of truth. And so we're going to play a classic, and it's kind of like Wachowski, well, they're not really the Wachowski brothers, because obviously Larry Wachowski had a sexual reassignment surgery and is now Lana Wachowski. And so part of what Cloud Atlas is very much about this idea of that love should be free. And so you have this idea of freedom and slavery, and also the enslavement of love, the enslavement of homosexuality in at a time when it was not, tolerated, and interracial love at a time when it wasn't tolerated. And so a lot of these things, you see these themes that obviously Lana Wachowski was probably, dealing with in her own life, and dealing with, being a woman trapped in a man's body for most of her life, making these, macho action pictures, and then, coming out with this really beautiful work of art that is very, very complex, based on the novel. So anyway, they made The Matrix before this. And so unfortunately, The Matrix has been turned into this like epic cliche. Like so many people have been quoting The Matrix and quoting the red pill, blue pill part and all this stuff. But the thing is, people aren't really looking at what does that really mean. And, it got all lost in the sequels and all the, the love story and this and that. But what are they really talking about in The Matrix? And that's part of what we're going to get into in the show today, when we get Andrew on here and start talking about the nature of, what did they mean. So we're going to play you a little quote. This is the classic quote from The Matrix. And this is when Neo and Morpheus sit down and meet for the first time. And this kind of sums it all up.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. Tumbling down the rabbit hole?
You could say that.
I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate, Neo?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Matrix.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage. Born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
Okay. A prison for your mind. Let's welcome in our friend Andrew Jones. Doctor, you with us?
I am with you.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm great.
Happy evening. So we wanted to get him started with the classic on the Matrix. You spent some time today talking to Ken Wilber, who actually did a very fascinating commentary on the Matrix for the DVD version, I guess with Cornel West. You've been spending some time with that dude out there. So what did he have to say about this?
Yeah, I've been really fortunate to spend some time talking with Ken. We sat down for a few hours today and we talked about a lot of different topics. Kind of talked about, it's really curious to see from his perspective, his model of kind of this idea of integral growth, how mankind throughout history has been coming to kind of higher and higher states of development and consciousness, and where that sits along with the ideas of freedom and slavery. And you can see obviously on the surface, on the outside, it's hard to deny that we've made some great strides towards liberation and freedom for mankind just over the past few hundred years. I think later on in the show we might want to go into give a little synopsis of the history of slavery. But I think one of the conclusions we kind of came to that was really interesting, part of Ken's theory, he talks about these lines of development, that we all have these different lines that some of us excel at. Some would have I would have a creative line of development that would be very strong. Some people have a cognitive line of development that's highly advanced. And we all have a moral line of development as well. And in a perfect world, we'd like to think that mankind, as we escalate up the chain in our understanding and our knowledge, that these lines develop simultaneously. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And where we are at the moment, we're placed very precariously, because the one line of development that seems to be kind of skyrocketing, that's taking a lot of the center stage, is the cognitive line of development, and especially in terms that relates to our technological advancements. And the danger is that when you have lines of development that are out of sync, when your cognitive is too high and your morality is too low, those are lines that don't have to sync up. So an example of high cognitive and low moral development would be, Nazi scientists is a great example of that. And where we are now is that, mankind is, we'd like to think that there's a certain amount of like awakening that's happening, and people are gaining more awareness. I kind of define consciousness as the ability to define the patterns and recognizing your environment. So we're seeing greater patterns. We're understanding these things. And however, the forces that seek to enslave mankind and keep us kind of in our slumber, in our sort of matrix slumber, they're right in line with the technological development and the power that is being gained through these technologies through NSA, through the mass surveillance of everyone, is also waking up, and not waking up in a good way, waking up in a much more organized way, waking up in they're finding more and more sophisticated ways to, in one sense, kind of obfuscate, the real cells of the prison walls. So, I mean, if you were to poll a bunch of people on the outside, and if you asked people if they thought that slavery still exists, a lot of people would think that slavery went out of style a little while ago. But I think the truth and part of the reality that we'll talk about tonight is that the essence of slavery is still very alive and well in our culture, in our society, in the systems of taxation, and it's become integrated into our culture in a way that we're not really aware. We're not able to. We're so deep entrenched into the matrix that we're not seeing the walls of our prison cells anymore.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, people would generally think that we're living in the most free time, since we've been recording history, but we hope to show you during this show the true nature of the fact that slavery must always exist in order for this model of civilization to perpetuate and for our economic system to perpetuate. We're going to take a break here. This is the Midnight Sunrise, and we're streaming live here on KMHD2.org. Please call us tonight. Join in the discussion. Our studio call-in line is 503-491-7419. We'll be back in a minute. Take a listen here to our friend Rena Jones. This is Dusk Till Dawn from her new record Echoes. Jones on the line, and we got Mikey D back in the studio. It's good to see you again, Mike. Can't keep telling you that enough, man. We have a lot of fun over here in the studio. There's all these buttons, and we keep trying to figure them out every week, and every week there's a new one.
I think they keep changing out here.
They keep changing them, but Andrew, you're lucky. You can just kick back in your office out there. You don't have to deal with all the buttons. So we were talking about freedom and slavery, and we opened up with a clip from Cloud Atlas, and we're talking about the Matrix as well, and the famous quote that you were born a slave. So what did they mean by that? Well, in the movie, the metaphor was that everybody didn't really exist, reality didn't really exist. It was a digital simulation, and it's a great metaphor. But it's, and again, it's one of those things that can mean a lot of things, but the Matrix ultimately means that it's this metaphor that we are living in a reality that is artificial, and that whoever we think we are in this reality and whatever we think our importance is in this reality is not true. And the truth is that we are something very different, in this case, a slave, and that we serve a system. In the Matrix, the people are batteries. They are essentially energy units for the machine.
Contributors.
That's a very blatant metaphor for what consumers are to the economic machine, the economic engine. We're just batteries in it.
But we continue to use this word slavery, and people have like this negative connotation to the, no one wants to be considered a slave. However, there is a place in our society for people to be contributing to the system, and for the system to work, we have to have people that are willing to adopt a role that could be argued as being a slave to a system, a slave to an industry.
Right.
But without it, things would come to a screeching halt.
Yeah.
The world as we know it.
As we know it, yes. And not that it's a fair system that any of us, voted on or anything, but it's a system that exists. And later on in the show, we'll go into why that system exists.
Right.
And, what it means to have a pyramid, and a pyramid as the basis of civilization. And what that means to have the bottom layer of the pyramid, who that bottom layer is, and what the significance of that bottom layer is. Why all of these societies have lower castes or slave castes or underclasses or these despised populations that, fill the bottom rung of society. It needs to exist for this particular model to happen. Cloud Atlas, and the Matrix try to turn all that on their head. They try to peer behind the curtain and look at the true nature of freedom and slavery. And in The Matrix, we'll start with the first movie that they did. The Matrix looked at, and asked you what is the nature of reality. And it took a very blatant, metaphor and kind of took you to a whole other world. So what is the actual real world that they're kind of alluding to in The Matrix? What's that, what's behind the metaphor? Well, the literal slavery that we, are experiencing is essentially, for lack of a better term, what we call debt slavery. And it's all based on this idea of the fiat currency system and the way that money and the economies of the world move. Andrew, you've used the term tax farm many, many, many times. And we talk about this, and you use it kind of in passing in a sentence, but when you say tax farm, that's directly what we're talking about here. What do you mean by tax farm?
Well, a way of looking at slavery is it's easy anyone would agree that if someone were to take 100% of your wages by force or by the extortion of coercion or violence, then you would be a slave. You give up 100% of your wages. The system we're in right now is we're in the terms of tax farm. I kind of consider what we're in right now is kind of a form of free range slavery. Would be an interesting way of looking at it. We're free range slaves, where if 20% or 30% of the toil and the blood, sweat, and tears of your labor is taken by force by an authoritarian power with the threat of coercion, violence, or prison, is 20% a slave? Is 30% slavery? Are you still not a slave? And I argue that we are. That it is. 1% is still slavery. So, because we live in a system where we're being extorted through the means of violence and our government into giving our wages through taxes, through property taxes that aren't of our own consent. That's a system. There's no euphemism we can make around it that's not a form of slavery that we're all involved in at the moment.
Right.
Beyond that, deeper than that, though, the nature of the tax farm and the nature of the slavery that we're trying to explain here exists on paper. You know, how do we try to explain to people, Mike, that we've got two of us existing on the planet? Okay, and here's one of the things that we're going to get into. We're kind of giving you some previews of what we want to talk about down the line, because we're going to get into the history stuff first and foremost. But I mean, the nature of what we're talking about here is in the idea of the corporation. Okay, and the corporation is the key to it all. At some point back in history, there was a pope. His name was Boniface III, I think. And he was the one who invented this idea of the corporation, which is to incorporate the wealth of a bunch of entities together into one entity that makes a collective decision. And this corporate entity, which is the kind of the way that the Vatican was able to maintain all of its wealth together independently of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the other principalities and all this stuff, is that it was a sovereign entity. And so later in the program, we're going to talk about how that sovereign entity, the corporation, infiltrated Europe and then the New World, and ultimately became the world that we're looking at today, the corporate world. That is on the verge of kind of overturning everything that we've understood about liberal government and also democracy and freedom. You know, almost every one of these futuristic dramas that we look at that looks at what the immediate future is going to look at, they all kind of look at this kind of corporate totalitarian state where all of our rights are gone and the corporations control things. And Cloud Atlas, They had this corporate state in the future, and the culture of humanity evolved to meet this corporate state, but also to keep the institution of slavery intact. So what I mean by that is when we had colonial slavery, it was justified, and the idea of white supremacy was justified by the Bible. Okay, they would say, in Leviticus here, and this particular, I forget the one that they cite. Ultimately, at Vatican II, they overturned it. They overturned the one thing that was the basis of colonialism when it said, serve thy master. And so, from that point on, they were converting people to Christianity, and they had a biblical mandate. And so slaves were taught not to rise up and not to challenge their masters because they would be struck down by God. In the future, in this reality, this new reality, in New Soul, this corporate reality, they've changed humanity. Now humanity's evolved because there's clones now. There's replicant human beings. So the clones are part of the, living population, but it's no longer humanity. Now they call it unanimity. Unanimity is both the humans and the artificial humans, or these, the replicants, the clones. And so all of unanimity must find harmony. And for that to exist, there's a natural order to things. This is what the social Darwinists used to say. There's a natural order. The darker your skin, the lower down the order you were born into. The lighter your skin, the higher up the order you were born into. And that's how they rationalized slavery for so long. And in this new order where they created a new kind of human, now this new kind of human is the slave, and they changed the religion so now that they have the new catechism, and the new catechism is honor thy consumer. Not honor thy master, but thy consumer. The consumer is now the master. So, it's the religion, the culture, and the economics that perpetuate slavery. It's all three of them at once, and they shift over time to justify the slaves. You have overt slaves that were taken from Africa, using Christianity, colonialism, the Bible to justify it. Then there's a democratic revolution. Then there's a civil rights movement. Then along comes neocolonialism in the form of globalization, and you have sweatshops everywhere that re-enslave everybody. So I guess what I'm saying, Andrew, and what I'm putting out there is that it's not just the, giving away 10% of your income or what have you. It's this idea of, do you have free choice to live, work, take care of your family? If losing your job becomes a catastrophic event that could result in, the illness, impoverishment, homelessness, or death of you or your family, that's slavery.
Which is most of the population.
Yeah.
Which is most of the population.
It is, and what's interesting too. I mean, it really comes down to it's a moral issue at the core. It's a power differential. It's much more about power than is a race, but it's morality. The idea of taking somebody's wages, which is their life. You're taking someone's life. You're taking a portion of their life by force, by extortion. That is immoral. There's no other way to look at it than that's an immoral activity. And what I always find really strange is you have all these religions of the world that preach about morality and the value of morality in the Catholic Church. When have you ever heard your priest or your rabbi ever speak out against taxation?
Never.
Ever speak out about the immorality of this? Never, because they're part of the system. It's part of the story and it's part of the game.
Because they're tax exempt.
Going on right now. And they're tax exempt.
They're tax exempt.
Yeah, don't. They're tax exempt, but it's never something where they ever wanted to take up arms against that. And you start seeing we kind of the moral relativism of that situation where you can it's okay. We're just gonna turn a blind eye to this grand global immorality that's being practiced at the same time. But we're not gonna go there. Let's not mention that. You see the institution. You see the corporatism of religion, and it's pretty disheartening.
Yeah, Timothy Leary always used to say that it's the priests and the politicians, working hand in hand, or dancing down the street hand in hand together, that hold the illusion together.
Yeah.
Dismissing the priests and the politicians is the first step to changing society. All right. We're going to take a little break here. We'll be right back here on the Midnight Sunrise. We're streaming live here on KMHD2.org. Please call us tonight, and we mean that. Give us a call. Come and talk to us.
and join the conversation
on our
Facebook
page.
Midnight
Sunrise Radio. We got a Twitter account. The call-in number here, 503-491-7419. That's 503-491-7419. This is a track from the new Magica Om record, Cosmic Sutras. Doc, you with us?
Yeah. Can you hear me, Charles?
Yeah, I sure can.
So something I'd like to, as we're kind of creating the framework for this conversation, as we talk about slavery, I think it's really important to also give kind of a definition for freedom, too, as these are obviously kind of hand in hand. And a book that I read recently it's one of these things. It's definitely one of the kind of a red pill literature. It's once I kind of read this book, it gave me it defined some new definitions for this conversation of slavery and evil. And the book is called The End of All Evil by Jeremy Locke. And I'd like to just to read a bit, if you can indulge me here. So, and this book starts off, the definition, this is the end of all evil. The definition of freedom is the infinite value of the human being. The definition of evil is the destruction of freedom. Everything that is evil teaches people that they have limited value. Simple. The truth is always simple. All people recognize truth because all people are intelligent beings. It is the nature of evil to create artificially complex ideas. It does this to hide or obfuscate the freedom it destroys. If you remove the complexities and fears from your life, you will find a plain and beautiful truth. This truth is the nature of your worth. The value of man. To understand freedom is to understand the value of a person. Everything that evil wants to disguise and destroy your value. All authority is created by evil men to disguise your worth. To understand your own worth is to understand the nature of liberty. Evil. The crucial key for understanding our world is to understand the nature of evil. Evil challenges the value of people by denying them the opportunity to make their own choices, by denying them the chance to grow strong in learning and understanding. The definition of freedom is the infinite value of human beings. The definition of evil is the destruction of freedom. Everything that is evil teaches people that they have limited value.
Wow.
And free,
wow.
Yeah. So it's pretty bare bones and clear cut when you look at it that way. And when you see evil in this light, just strip away the bed knobs and broomsticks and the devils and the ghosts and all these sort of things, and if you just see that, it makes a pretty clear-cut argument that all authority, all governments, any ism, communism, democracy, environmentalism, all these are tools that power uses to take away your worth, take away your value, and encourage its own agenda.
Right. There's a line that Sami says in Cloud Atlas when she says, you can maintain power over people as long as you give them something. When you rob a man of everything, that man will no longer be in your power. And if you think of the dynamic of slavery, the slave is completely dependent upon the master. He's isolated, or she's isolated, and is ignorant in the sense that they are kept from knowledge, and they are kept from knowledge of their own situation, and they are kept from literacy and the ability to learn and to become conscious of their situation. Now, in a lot of the consciousness and revolution talks I've given over the last couple of years, one of the key historical periods that I focus on is the Black Power movement and what happened when a people had to, learn how to become free in their minds, how to let go of the enslavement that they still had in their minds. Now, we had literal slavery. It morphed into Jim Crow segregation and second-class status, and then ultimately it morphed into Black Power. And the Black Power came along when other ideologies and perspectives started coming into the black community. Much to the chagrin of the United States government, one of the most influential ones was communism, Marxism, and the writings of Mao Zedong, particularly with the Black Panthers. They used to make their money by selling the Red Book on the streets to people. That was Mao's writing. There's a scene in Cloud Atlas that's very reminiscent of the old, Uncle Tom's Cabin and the old slave narratives, where two of the clones sneak out at night and they go exploring around in the mall where they work. And in a closet, one of the clones has come up with a little video, player, it's like a cell phone. And they sit and they watch a show of, what ultimately is like a dramatic recreation of, one of the other characters. And they're watching this dramatic program. It's just a made-for-TV movie type thing. But it's completely forbidden to them. And the one clone starts to freak out saying, we can be exterminated for this. Now, slaves, lived under the threat of, being hung if they were caught reading. They weren't allowed to read or write, and, to be an educated slave was, pretty much a death sentence, a death wish. to keep a people ignorant is the first step in keeping them down. And so in this, scene where they look at this little video, they are breaking the taboo, the tree of knowledge. They're eating the fruit,
In times of the Roman slaves, there's a form of knowledge and a form of learning called the trivium. And there was whenever the trivium was a fundamental way of understanding, and that was also something that if someone was taught teaching the trivium to a slave, they would either be whipped or put to death in any sort of those cases. And but that's the nature of power. Information is power. So to keep that power differential, keeping information with people is a vital way of controlling that. It's unfortunately that human beings, and there's part of our nature is, we do want to share. I love sharing information. I love teaching someone the fundamental principles of drawing or line or form of colors, those sort of things. And so it's to not share knowledge, to not teach people, it goes against the grain of our nature, and that's why I think that these systems are so completely unnatural. And I think it's we live in a natural world. You look at nature. Nowhere in nature is there slavery. There's no. I mean, there might be a couple like ant colony. Well, I guess there's different sort of insects that implant their pupas and their larvae into other insects on top of that. But slavery in general is not something you find in the natural world. It's corrosive to the human spirit.
Yes.
But it's become such an ingrained aspect of the way that this system has evolved. It's shocking. Yeah. And something also that Ken and I talked about is that you look at the storyline and the analogies of the Matrix. At first blush, it's really terrifying to see that the way that the system was put into place. But when you think about it and you overlay it to where we're at right now, the Matrix is actually a very romantic vision of slavery, because you've got very clear cut enemies. You have this artificial intelligence that is definitely that's definitely the boogeyman. And everybody that's enslaved, they're trapped into these like embryonic chambers where they're never able to wake up from. So there's this one clear adversary in this. However, what I find terrifying about where we are right now is that we can't even really point to that, because we, as people, as part of culture, we are creating the slavery. Slavery is a choice that we're all willingly participating in. We can try to point fingers and point blame and find people to be responsible, but ultimately we bear the responsibility of our own slavery. And until we're able to really take a critical look at the system that's in place and what we're all being part of, until we can really see that, it's impossible for there to be any lasting progress whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's going to the only change is going to come from us taking ultimate responsibility for the role that we all play in this, because we're all guilty. So many of the lifestyle that we have, the luxuries, our technology, our iPhones, the misconception of what we consider our slavery is based on the exploitation of hundreds and millions of people around the planet. Billions of people. Billions of people.
Let's be clear.
Pay the price. Let's just get real. Billions of people are, and so it creates a very, very vicious cycle that we get addicted to. We're addicted to being slaves. Honestly,
I remember the part
we're
that I was
mainlining slavery.
Yeah, we are mainlining slavery. Yeah, and I want to put a bookmark on that thought, because that's a good one. Because we can't help ourselves. So the thing that I was trying to remember from Cloud Atlas was another scene where the clone's being she's being interrogated before she's executed. She ultimately is executed in the end after making the speech that you heard at the beginning of the show. And there's a whole relationship that develops between this rebel captain who saves her and her ultimate decision to speak out and to become this symbol of, liberation, and ultimately a whole religion is built around her. But it's a simple act. It's the act of this one captain, this human, treating her like a fellow human. And she said it was the first time, that anyone ever treated me with decency. Now, we just got a message here from one of our listeners, a guy named Sam Andrus, and he said, I wanted to chime in and ask about how you view the moral character of those at the top of the pyramid. If there's good and evil in all of us. By criticizing the actions of those in power, are we pointing to our fellow humans who happen to be in charge of governments and leaders and corporations and calling them evil? Or are we simply pointing to evil itself and asking how to deal with it wherever it appears? So, I'm going to just answer Sam's question right off the bat by saying that, my point in this last example is to address the moral character of those at the top of the pyramid. Slavery is something that exists in the mind as much as it exists in law. If you see someone as a slave as lesser than you, if you look down on them because of their socioeconomic status or because of their culture, and you don't humanize them, that's where it starts. It's in the dehumanization. But the moral character of the people at the top of the pyramid determine the morality of everybody below, because the people at the top determine morality, right? So it's their religions and their cultures that ultimately create our moral structure. So if they validate slavery as part of it...
But they're only able to create this moral structure because the most of our population lacks their own conviction to determine their own moral structure. Like, if people walking around think of themselves as an enslaved position, like, I'm a slave to work, I have to go. If I don't go to work because I'm sick today, I'm not going to pay my rent. That's being enslaved to a system. So if that's my philosophy, I've enslaved myself. And on the opposite side, I hear, I'm a contractor, and I hear a lot of other contractors around me, and it's horrible. I hear them say it, but I hear it a lot. And they'll be like, you know what this job needs? We need some Mexicans.
Yeah.
And it's because they work hard and they'll work cheap. But is that correct?
Yeah.
They're choosing an attitude of putting themselves exalted above these people. But, it goes back and forth. It could be the same person just trying to make their rent that's putting themselves above their own coworkers.
Right.
So, like you said, it's a matter of attitude.
Yeah.
Well, also, in the words of the great Terence McKenna, the bard, culture is not your friend. And when we want to talk about, what are the tools of slavery, what are the weapons of slavery? Obviously, violence is a very clear-cut one, but the subtle one, and the one that's even more powerful that I think is overlooked, is culture. Culture is a weapon of slavery. In the end of all evil, culture distorts principles in order to defend the authority of evil. Culture must convince you that it is not wrong when law subjugates your worth and destroys your freedom. Culture convinces people of this by perverting the concept of morality. So, throughout history, the way it kind of balances out is that it's either culture or violence, and in a system or in a government where the culture is stronger, like say the United States, I think we have a very strong culture here. Where the culture is strong, you need less violence, and in a system where the culture is weaker, they exercise more violence. It's this subtle balance, but culture is, I think, it's actually one of the most diabolical ways that slavery is enforced, because it makes us all such willing participants in it.
Yeah.
We're so unwilling. I mean, the hardest thing, and we've talked about this too, Charles. I mean, the most difficult thing I think there is, the most difficult task to have, is to actually change a person's way of life.
Right.
When it comes to that, I mean, give me whatever information or poetry or book or song or whatever, but don't make me change the ways that I've been accustomed. Don't make me change what I'm addicted to as far as this culture. And it's going to take nothing less than a massive shift in the way that we view ourselves, the relation to ourselves, our relationship with value, and our compassion with each other. It'll take nothing less than that. But for me, when that definition of freedom that I talked about, the ability for a human being to express his unlimited worth. I mean, that's something that resonates really powerfully for me. You know, when you see it when you see it through that lens, it becomes very clear. And I think that's the game of this show, is to show the simplicity of what we're talking about. Because culture and governments, they rule by complexity. They make things as confusing as possible. So you either just give up trying to look at it because it's too complicated. You don't want to get involved, and the new Game of Thrones is on. So whatever you're talking about, let's just table that conversation because I've got this carrot that I'm chasing after, and the chase becomes so overwhelming that we lose sight of the whole race in general. And we're losing the race right now.
Yeah,
we're losing the race. You know, we're not even in the Special Olympics at the moment, unfortunately.
You know, Henry Miller in Tropic of Capricorn said, you know, things would only change through, you know, a change in heart, and who can change the hearts of men? And, you know, he really believed that it was kind of hopeless, that, you know, like our friend Matthew McConaughey on True Detective, you know, what does he say, that human consciousness is a genetic aberration? Is that what? So he says, you know, that we're an accident that we became this conscious. And,
because he bases that because it's the belief in the self.
Right.
That we all believe that we're selves. You know, the great lie is that we're all dreaming that we're human beings.
So here's the real question. And this is something that ties into, you know, a lot of the cultural beliefs that we have in the alternative culture. Is, you know, as Sam Andrus asked here in his question, you know, is it that there is, you know, good and evil, and that there are evil people doing evil things to us, or is it that we're just pointing out evil itself and ascribing it to others? So is it that that we are all one living in a corrupt and evil system, or is it that there is an us and a them, and some people truly are evil and believe in things like slavery? You know, they don't call it slavery now. What they call it is job creation. I create job. I'm a job creator. You know, when I go over to China and I employ 50,000 people in a lockdown factory with nets around the base of the building in case the suicide jumpers, you know, get it in their heads, so the nets will stop them from killing themselves. I mean, what is that but slavery?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what the answer that I think of when that question that was raised, it gets into a place of really quickly you get into a conversation kind of this non-duality, where even in the trilogy of The Matrix, you know, the first Matrix movie, the story was that you're in the Matrix. The second one was why is the Matrix, and the third is how do we get out of the Matrix? And you'll find that the popularity of each movie, the third one was the least popular. You know, there's a lot of reasons why it's so unpopular, but getting out of the Matrix is not a popular idea for people. But something that's really interesting that Ken actually brought up. Ken was one of the first people to recognize this. There's a lot of elements of the film that aren't very clear at first blush. But at that last final scene where Neo becomes, you know, it goes through all the stages and becomes enlightened, and he sees everything as clear light, he realizes that the Matrix itself, that is artificial intelligence, was made up of spiritual light. And that's something that I think a lot of people miss in that film, that the Matrix itself was part of spirituality.
Right.
The Matrix itself was light. And that's one of the things I talked about with Ken. I kind of questioned, you know, I'm like a true sycophant at the moment, you know, and
that's great.
you get these. It's really easy to get all you read The End of All Evil and you see how screwed up things are, and you get all fired up, you know, and you're like, what's going on? And man, how am I going to change this? And there's a lot of ego that comes into that. There's a lot of idealism. I'm very guilty of idealism. When I was asking Ken, I'm like, do we even have? Let's be real. Has there ever been a precedent on planet Earth where humans lived in freedom? Ever? Has that ever happened? Is the idea, if we can talk about these ideals of freedom and what would it be like if everyone lived in a state of their unlimited worth, but is that even something that humans are capable of?
Yes.
Yes. Is it something that we can? You do truly believe that that's something that is possible? Because there's never been any evidence historically that we can look at. I mean, we can even look at Native Americans. There are systems where there was less pain and suffering, but is it part of our nature, or is this element, is slavery and is evil? Is this like, is it created for us to grow from? Do we need this resistance in order to develop as spiritual beings? So
there needs to be a counterbalance,
counterbalance.
Negative force pushing in the opposite direction. That makes perfect sense. We got to take a break here on Midnight Sunrise Radio. We're coming to you live from KMHD in Portland, streaming live on KMHD2.org. And we want you to listen to a little track here from Loving Light's new record. This one's called The War on Consciousness.
Certain forces active upon the earth aim to artificially suppress the natural evolution of human consciousness. News to some to hear that humanity is constantly being bombarded by forces and events that are beyond our control. It is these forces that aim to target the very spaces in which humanity has a modicum of free choice and free will. Think about where you're sitting right now.
HD2, Gresham, Portland.
All right, welcome back to the Midnight Sunrise. This is Charles Shaw. I'm with Android Jones and Mikey D, our resident engineer. That was our station identification thing, KMHD2.org. So we miss our buddy Rab. He's down in Costa Rica with his family, frolicking on a beach, having a great time. And so we miss him, but we're shouting out to him. Before we...
Frederick Douglass, slaves are generally expected to sing as well as to work.
Yeah, right. Sing for your supper. So we're going to take a few minutes here and play you a clip from a presentation of a guy that Andrew and I have been listening to a little bit lately. And you may have heard him on the Joe Rogan show recently. His name's Stefan Molyneux. And Andrew, you know a little bit more about the dude than I do, so why don't you set up a little bit of what they're going to hear here and who our friend is.
Yeah, Stefan, he's an amazing philosopher. I think that's the framework I define him in. Stefan I'd encourage anyone to go to freedomainradio.com is Stefan's website, and he has just such a treasure trove of videos that go into so many different aspects of culture and humanity and history, and he's another guy that really gets at the truth of a lot of issues, and I like Stefan because he does an amazing amount of research. He has a very, very quick wit and is very intellectual in the way he just breaks down a lot of these systems. And by listening to Stefan's work, I've been able to, he ties together a lot of different chords and speaks in a very kind of plain English way about the systems that exist and the state that we're in. And he's also, I really like the conversations he has around anarchy, minarchism, and the different. He brings up a lot of interesting solutions for why we're in the situation we're in, and some different ideas on how we can liberate ourselves. So let's play that clip.
Yeah, this is a clip from a presentation he gave called "The Truth About Slavery," and this is called "The History of Slavery."
Slavery is an ancient institution common to all cultures throughout history up until the 19th century, and in many places into the 20th and 21st century. How did you become a slave? Well, you became an insolvent debtor, ran out of money. You were sold into slavery by your parents, or you were born to slave parents a lot of times, or you were captured through kidnapping by slave raiders and pirates, particularly the Barbary Coast. Slave dealing was an accepted way of life throughout all of human history, fully established in all societies, unopposed by religion, in fact, almost always supported by religion. Christians supported slavery through the Old Testament. Muslims supported slavery explicitly, and Jews supported slavery, ran a lot of the slave trade. Now, a lot of the slaves in the world throughout history were white people or Europeans. In fact, the very word slave comes from Slav, or people of Eastern Europe. Now, the people from Eastern Europe, the reason why Slav became slave was because for thousands of years they were subjected to every conqueror who swept through the region. Celts, Greeks, Romans, barbarians, or the Conans. The ancient Greeks, who a lot of Westerners get culture, art, music, and philosophy from, were utterly dependent on slavery. Plato's Republic, one of the first blueprints for fascistic totalitarianism in the history of the world, was firmly based on slave labor. Plato himself said that owning 50 or more slaves represented the possessions of a wealthy man. Under Roman law, rebellions against your slave owners were kind of discouraged. So if your slave owner was ever found killed, all of the slaves, all of you would be put to death. There was one Roman slave owner who was found murdered, and 400 of his slaves were put to death. So, a little tough to get out of the institution. 0 AD, or when Christ was born, half of the population of the Roman Empire was slaves. 3/4 of the population of Athens were slaves. Now, not really known very often, up to 1/2 or more of the arrivals in the American colonies early on were white slaves. We'll get into that a little bit later. They were slaves for life. Generally, the slavery was hereditary. Some of them were called indentured servants, so they would sign up or be kidnapped and sold into bondage. Yet these contracts were generally extended at will. Nobody was really there to enforce them. It was rare in America to own slaves. At the very peak of black slavery in America, only 6% of Southern whites owned slaves. This, of course, would be the richest 6%, and we'll get into how they used the state to maintain slavery in a few minutes. So if you include all the white people in the North at the very height of slavery, only 1.4% of white Americans owned black slaves. Monstrous, immoral. That was the truly evil 1% of the day. Slavery was, of course, indigenous to African and Arab countries before it made its way to Europe. Slavery was widely practiced by the tribes of American Indians long before Columbus came to the New World. Ethiopia had slavery until 1942, Saudi Arabia until 1962, Peru until 68, India until 76, and Mauritania until 1980. Also coming a tad late to the anti-slavery party was the Catholic Church, because certain passages in the Old Testament sanctioned slavery. The New Testament didn't give any clear teachings to abolish it. In 1965, the Second Vatican Council declared without qualification that slavery was an infamy that dishonored the Creator and was a poison in society. To be fair, Christians, theologians mostly followed St. Augustine in arguing that slaves should be treated well, and they did discourage the owning of Christian slaves. Blacks owned slaves. Even in America, according to the United States Census of 1830, in just the one town of Charleston, South Carolina, 407 black Americans owned slaves themselves. One study has concluded that 28% of free blacks owned slaves, which is far higher than the free whites who owned slaves. It was a lot of a class thing. I mean, the rich whites would own slaves. The poor whites hated slavery and hated the institution for a variety of reasons we'll get into, not least of which was the fact that it drove down the price of labor to the point where they found it almost impossible to compete. Now, what are some of the myths? Well, slavery is often portrayed as a free market phenomenon that had to be ended by governments. But the reality is there were, in fact, only two countries in the history of the world that found it necessary to end, or at least attempt to end, slavery through civil war. One was the United States of America, and the other was Haiti. Of course, the Civil War, as we'll get to in the next presentation, the truth about Abraham Lincoln, didn't really have anything to do with slavery, but had more economic motives. So slavery was a worldwide phenomenon that existed from prehistory until the 18th and 19th centuries, when Western powers, in particular England, ended it as a moral crusade. Now, why were so many Africans enslaved? Well, one of the reasons was because the African rulers within Africa, particularly in southern middle Africa, were endlessly warring against each other, civil wars and so on. They would capture slaves, they would bring them to the seaports where the Europeans and the Arabs would pick them up. Some Arabs went inland. But you couldn't, as a white person, you couldn't go into Africa. I mean, the average life expectancy for a white person going to Africa was 11 months. You just get downed by big and small animals, lions or bugs of various kinds, cholera and so on. So they had to get caught by the black rulers, and then they would be shipped off to the ports where they'd be picked up by the Arabs and the Europeans. England, as a moral crusade led by a man we'll meet in a moment, was ended by attacking the slave ships, agitating for the removal of government support for slavery, which is really essential, and bribing slave owners to release their slaves or buying their property. Of course, you can't, under common law, retroactive law is not valid. I can't say something was illegal 5 years ago and charge you for that. So what was legitimate property had to be bought, and the British government did spend a lot of blood and treasure trying to end slavery. So, I mean, this is one of the great misconceptions of history. So, Western Europeans were very late to the party. The Muslim slave trade went on for 1,400 years. The Christian slave trade went on for a few hundred years. They were late to the party. They took very few of the slaves, as we'll see. They treated their slaves far better than what occurred in the Muslim countries, as we'll also see. So Europeans ended up fighting against slavery. Europeans ended slavery, and therefore you only ever hear Europeans being blamed for slavery. This is horribly unjust. Look, if we want to move the moral standard of mankind further up, which I think we all want to do, let's stop attacking everyone who shows the first sign of conscience and better behavior in the world, and only ascribe the blame to them.
That's a pretty fascinating ending statement there. Let's stop attacking anybody who shows a sign of conscience. That's pretty deep, you know. Mm-hmm. What he doesn't talk about is the deep history of slavery, which begins as soon as we came out of our hunter-gatherer phase and moved into cities and formed this thing called civilization, right? So hunter-gatherers would have had no need for slaves because they would have been, you know, they would have consumed whatever food they were foraging for, and there wouldn't have been enough for them. So once people were able to cultivate and they had big farms, then that's when, you know, wars started over property, and then the conquered would become slaves for the conquering power. So this, you know, idea of Western slavery goes back 10,000 years to the cradle of civilization in Iraq. And it's also interesting, he points out that early abolitionists were in the form of two Jewish sects, you know, the Essenes and the Therapeutae. And they, you know, started the practice of buying slaves in order to free them. You know, practice of slavery passes on to Greece. The ancient Greeks, you know, preferred women and children as slaves for domestic work, you know, rather than the men, because the men tended to be rebellious and ended up being slaughtered. The Roman Empire, you know, was the largest empire of its time, and slaves were the, you know, key engine of that economy. And the thing in Rome is if you were born a slave and your master dies, then you were either sold off to another master or killed because you were, you know, just excess mouths. Now, today there's a parallel in that in what the Marxists call surplus population. This idea that you have too many mouths, too many bodies, and not enough jobs. And so, one of the things that ended up happening to the black community was that this idea of second-class citizenry never went away. And this is a controversial statement, but if you've ever read The New Jim Crow, if you look at the prison epidemic, if you look at what happened to the black community over the course of 1950 to 1980, what you see is the systematic destruction of a potentially revolutionary culture, a subculture, a subpopulation in America. And so they were slaves. They couldn't be slaves anymore, so they became second-class citizens under an apartheid law called Jim Crow. And then when they got rid of Jim Crow, what they did was they continued to apply as much second-class status as possible to black folks by getting them caught up in the criminal justice system. So when something like 30 to 60% of all the males in a subpopulation have a criminal record or are in prison, you've got mass second-class citizenry or segregation again. Okay, so getting back to the history. So medieval Europe is where the church started condoning slavery, except it's interesting that the only place that they didn't condone it was when the Muslims raided Christian villages and took Christian slaves. Then that wasn't cool with them. So with the colonial empires, the Portuguese were the ones who inaugurated the Atlantic slave trade. And then they were quickly followed by the Spanish and the Dutch and the English. This is where the Middle Passage came from, where that ships were loaded with African slaves, most of whom died in the crossing over to either South America or to North America. It's interesting, Brazil and the United States share a lot of commonalities in the sense that there was a strong indigenous population there that was wiped out to make room for a colonial population that had black slaves. So you have, you have blacks in Brazil, you have mixed black and indigenous, you have black and white, and you have the same kind of three classes that you have in the United States, right? So, then of course, we know all about Brazil and Cuba, Haiti, the West Indies, South America. This is mostly the sugar plantations and the cotton plantations. And then you have abolitions. And then, of course, you get to the United States and then the Civil War. One of the things he also mentioned, he alluded to another presentation he has about Lincoln. And I think it's important for people to understand that, we are taught that the Civil War was about slavery. We are taught that Lincoln was this great abolitionist, but he wasn't. He never campaigned against slavery. People understood that abolitionism was an untenable political choice back in the day. What was happening with the United States was that it was being pulled apart by the European powers, the royalties and the banking systems that controlled the royalties. And their intention was to take the United States and break it into a bunch of smaller countries that could be more easily managed. What Lincoln did was try to hold together the Union. And later, the way that he justified being able to occupy the South to hold together the Union was through the issue of slavery and Reconstruction and the seizing of farms and assets and destroying essentially what could have been a competing economy. All of the bonds, the bond market that held together the Confederate States of America were all based on slave industries. If you suddenly made the bond market go away, you wiped out everybody's life savings. So after the Civil War, the South was occupied and completely impoverished. Now, the question that Sam brought up, and we're getting back to this whole idea of slavery was invented with civilization. Now we're going to start getting deep into the rabbit hole when we come back from our break. But Andrew, we'll let you have the last word before we go out into our break. So go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, no, let's follow that up. I think we can get into some Daniel Quinn and some the first signs of agriculture as some of the roots. So I think when we get back, we can start talking about the roots, the causal factors of slavery, and our relationship with it.
For sure. You are listening to The Midnight Sunrise. We're streaming live here on KMHD2.org. You can call in our studio if you'd like. Our studio call-in line is 503-491-7419. You can also get to us on Skype, too. You can just send a contact request to midnightsunriseradio@gmail.com. That's midnightsunriseradio@gmail.com. All right. This is a little Emancipator. Welcome back to the Midnight Sunrise. We're talking about freedom and slavery tonight. And so there's this book. It's by a guy named William Bramley, and it's called The Gods of Eden. And it's kind of out there. There's a straight-up disclaimer. This book is really out there. What Mr. Bramley postulates in his book is that humanity, as we understand it, is essentially the chattel property of an alien race that came to this planet at some point in time and created a slave race. Now, whether or not this is true, I mean, I'm, inclined to stray away from this as some kind of statement of absolute truth. There's, a lot of storylines out there that point to, an older civilization behind, that was there 10,000 and longer. And where did we get this idea? There's a lot of Illuminati lore that says that, they were the remnants of the Atlantean civilization that regrouped in Sumer and founded what we understand to be cities and civilization. But what Bramley says is that, this idea of the pyramid is the symbol of civilization. And this is the basic understanding that we have. Our society is structured like a pyramid. And so the 1% is at the top of the pyramid, and they own all of the businesses. They own the means of distribution, the means of transportation. They own the printing presses. They create the money. They create the business. They create the jobs. They hold us in their hands as their slaves, essentially. They determine whether or not we work, whether or not we prosper, whether or not we reproduce, and we can take care of a family. It's all up to them. Now, they maintain control through three main mechanisms, okay? And he says that the first is this idea of religion, and the second is this idea of trade, and the third is this idea of war. And religion, they control people, they control society by placing an intermediary between you and the direct experience of the divine. Now, the ancient esoteric traditions, the Wiccans, the pagans, their spiritual beliefs were all basically predicated on the direct one-to-one experience of spirituality with Gaia, with the Mother Spirit, with nature, with whatever it is. You had a direct experience. Yes, there were priestesses. Yes, there was a kind of a priest class, but it didn't operate in the same way. Now, when you got into the hierarchical civilizations, you started to create these religions that had a priest class. And the priest class were the only ones that were blessed and able to talk to the gods. And so you had to pay them to talk to the gods. And you had to pay them to curry favor with the gods or to have your prayers heard or, on your normal tax days, your religious holidays, and so on and so forth. And so a higher strata of the population was created with this priest class. And so the priest tells you what to do and what not to do. and they use the fear of displeasure of the gods in order to coerce you. The second part is this creation of currency, or this idea that there has to be a medium of exchange between people so that there isn't a direct mode of exchange between people. Now, anarchism teaches us that we can have direct exchange, direct trade, direct democracy, direct governance. But this model of hierarchical pyramid-based civilization says that no, there needs to be an elite class that creates the currency, distributes it to us, regulates the amount of this currency, determines how much you can have, how much you can't, and who you can trade with and who you can't. And then, of course, there is the final corner of the pyramid, which is warfare. And this idea that some are chosen and some aren't. Survival of the fittest, whatever you want to use to justify the use of force, violence, and coercion of one population over another. And to do that, they create fear between peoples. So instead of the direct communication between Mike and me looking across the table here because we're getting all mad at each other about something, we want to resolve it, we can talk to each other. Well, no, they say no. We have to resolve this, and we're going to resolve this through fighting. And usually it's a conflict between the ruling class that they send the poor out to fight for and to die for. Right? So in the pyramid, we have a permanent slave class, and that is the bottom rung of society. So it's called many different things. They could be called, the homeless or the untouchable caste. They could be called indentured slaves. They could be called factory workers in China. They could be called, Monsanto slaves in India making BT corn. However you see it, there is a slave class that has to take the lowest wages and has to take all of the cultural shame in order to justify the existence of those just above them in the pyramid. So in the case of American history, slaves displaced poor whites because they drove down wages, because they weren't getting paid. That meant that whites would get paid next to nothing. And for them to feel better, they were told, well, but you're not black, you're white, so you're part of the club. You can hang out with us. You can use these bathrooms with us. Even though there's no real difference between the power of the black slave or the sharecropper under Jim Crow and the poor white farmer, they have pretty much the same thing. But the farmer thinks that he's superior by mere virtue of the color of his skin. Racism has justified slavery since the dawn of time. You need to have some kind of method of putting an underclass. Now we have a criminal underclass. Now you've got millions and millions and millions of people that are second-class citizens because they committed an offense, even though most of them are, nonviolent drug offenses. So to break the pyramid, to break slavery, we have to create a system that isn't hierarchical and doesn't require, elaborate justifications of market economics to say that, we essentially need a race to the bottom. And, I bring this up also in particular to note that the Trans-Pacific Partnership right now is being discussed. It's the largest free trade agreement ever. It involves 11 nations around the Pacific Rim, including the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. And what this threatens to do is to completely undo any idea of sovereignty and to create a corporate bureaucracy that would even kind of dwarf that of the WTO. And that's where we're headed.
Yeah. What I like about what Stephen makes really clear is that slavery is not. I think we need to get to the causal factors to make any kind of progress. And I like the point that you make that slavery is not a race issue. We're led to believe that it's based off race because once you add racism into the argument, it becomes much more complicated, and you're not really seeing the roots. And when we talk about going back to the kind of hunter-gatherers, Daniel, one of my favorite books is called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And he comes to this point, he kind of decodes in his own way a lot of the religious metaphors into kind of seeing like why are we in the place where we are right now. And he boils down a lot of the cultural woes we have to agriculture. Before we were nomadic, and then suddenly we had agriculture, which was this breakthrough technology And for the first time, that kind of pit, that Cain and Abel was agriculture against nomadic. It's kind of a metaphor for that. But where it talks about, when we first see slavery kind of cropping up, pun intended on that one, is with agriculture. Because for the first time, before that, when we were living nomadic, we were living at our means. We had everything we needed. We went out and we got that day. Agriculture taught us for the first time that we could actually have more than we needed. And when we were able to produce, slavery, I think at its core, it's an issue of value and power. It's not race. It's value and power. And when we saw that a human being can create value, more value than it needs for that day, then that was the roots of slavery. We started saying, okay, well, you're going to work for me, and you're going to make this, you're going to make these extra crops, and I'm going to be able to profit off of your labor, and then I'm going to be able to hoard that value. Your labor is value, and it came from people realizing they could hoard value. And they talk about that, the roots of slavery, the roots of control is when we learned that we could put food under lock and key, then we disconnect people from their ability to make food and create all these other different sort of classes and roles, and now food is power. And now that power is something that can be hoarded, can be collected, and it can be used to manipulate and get leverage over other people. And what I think what's kind of interesting about this, and what I want to get into, is the fact that we have a relationship with slavery, and for us to really see the picture clear, we need to be in acknowledgement of that. And I think something that one of my favorite researchers, Mark Passio, talks about a lot is that the tyranny that we experience is in direct correlation to the morality that we have. And we'd like to point fingers and look at the oppressors and woe is me, but we really have to take responsibility for where we are as a culture. And this gets into that idea before. I was saying that how culture is actually used as a tool that reinforces the tyranny we deserve because of the morality that it erodes within us. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of keep in mind when you look at where we are. And I think this also relates to where Charles, you and me are as artists, or Rab as an artist, where this culture that we're reinforcing is we're complicit in that. Frederick Douglass has a great quote: "Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them. Only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears." I think that's a really kind of powerful idea. So that brings up the interesting idea of how much of our art is the product from the pain of the slavery that we create. How much in our daily lives are we, by compliance, participating and adding to the slavery that we see all around us, and what is the responsibility that culture comes into play with our own slavery?
Yeah. Did you see 12 Years a Slave, Doc?
I did see that.
Yeah. So you remember the scene when, it's like midway through the film, and he's just been, getting setback after setback, and he'd just been, almost hung, and he almost died while all the other slaves are kind of walking around in the background as if he's not dangling there by his neck. I mean, it was a pretty harrowing scene. And so they go and they baptize somebody in the river, I guess, and then they all start singing. And, he's sitting there listening to all the other slaves singing, and then finally, he just starts belting it out himself, and he starts crying, and you realize, it's very clear that the scene in the film is communicating to the viewer that, this slave song was a song of sorrow. It was a song, it was the only way that they could express this terrible pain that they had inside of themselves was to sing. And singing for their supper came out of that, but it was all about expressing their sorrow, right? So, Getting back to the pyramid and getting back to society, I want to get into the next aspect of this, because now, we were talking about the notion of freedom and the notion of slavery. Now, we've been talking about historical slavery, but let's talk about what's really going on today. And so this starts with, like I said, this idea of the corporation and Pope Boniface creating the first corporation, which then spread out and was used as a tool of colonialism to conquer the rest of the world. The number one entity in European colonialism was the British East Indies Company, and that was a private corporation. But they were so powerful, they fielded their own navy, and they launched 2 wars against the Chinese to keep them addicted to opium, for example. But in this idea of the empire of the city, this is what grew out of this idea of the corporate city-state. So the Vatican becomes the first corporate city-state. It becomes its own little entity. So the little area in the middle of Rome secedes from the rest of Rome and becomes a corporate entity. Very soon after that, the banking system that was set up in Europe, which grew out of the Rothschild family, moves into England, into the British Empire, and sets up what's called the City of London. Now, if anyone's ever been to London, and I go to London at least twice a year, it's where all my funding comes from. It's like a second family for me, and I'm obsessed with British history. And so, you go there, and in the very center of London, there's a whole separate city. It's called the City of London. Not the London metro area, but it's where all the banks are. And it is the pure realm of the Queen, and there's no real rights there. There's no, it is a specifically different kind of jurisdiction that they've got there. All right, it doesn't, normal British law doesn't apply. It's all, essentially all about this maritime admiralty financial law. And then, when there was this movement to take this empire of the city and expand it, the elite powers, you want to call them the Illuminati, but it was definitely, a group called the Freemasons, and this is our founders, like, George Washington and Monroe and Adams and all these guys, Ben Franklin. These guys were Freemasons. They had this idea. This idea was that, there could be an empire that based on the Roman Republic, that would be an empire of enlightenment. It wouldn't be beholden to the Vatican, and it wouldn't be beholden to any king. That's the story that they founded it, and they founded this thing called Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. is the federal district of Columbia. It is a separate United States of America. It is not the continental United States, okay? So everything that comes out of Washington is issued by the corporation known as the United States of America. This is where it starts to get really arcane and confusing. So all you, friendly researchers out there that are listening to us, this is something that is really hard to find concrete, facts on. Okay, so we're trying to unearth as much of this as possible.
Well, there's only 3 city-states in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is, and they're called London, the Empire of the City.
And Washington, D.C.
And so technically, Washington, America was set up as the military arm, London was set up as the financial arm, and the Vatican was the spiritual arm. And the 3 of those are the 3 corners of the pyramid that ended up, forming this New World colonialism. So the way that this corporate system works, the corporate United States works, is that it issues every one of us a share, or it issues a share in this corporation. Well, each share of the corporate United States is us. We are each a share. So now there's 312 million shares of the corporation of the United States. Each of them is worth an average lifetime earning. So let's say Mike here, as a contractor, your average lifetime earning is $1.5 million over the course of your lifetime. The Federal Reserve, which is not a government entity, private bank, can borrow against that $1.5 million that you will make over your lifetime. So you are born into debt slavery. And this is how we understand it. Okay? And your Social Security number and the national debt are all part of this debt slavery that you're born into. Your government has the right to borrow against you and your children and your grandchildren's future. And if that isn't the definition of slavery, that you are born into a debt that you did not take on consciously or did not consent to, and that you have to spend your life paying back, That sounds to me a lot like slavery. All right, we're going to take a break here. You're listening to Midnight Sunrise Radio. We're streaming live here on KMHD2.org. And this is our friend Hopscotch.
Welcome to the Garden of Eden. Feast your eyes on whatever's pleasing. Now take yourself away from the day to day and now that I know what real love is, I don't wanna go back. Now that I know what real love is, I don't wanna go back. Swam out into the sea. You swam out and saved me. So what if I think you saved me? You saved me. I don't wanna go back. 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 Now that I know what real love is, I don't wanna go back.
I don't want to go back. That's one of my favorite people on the entire planet singing right there, Miss Anahata. So we were talking about the Empire of the City, and Doc, you were going to throw something in there before we had to take our commercial break. What were you going to add?
Yeah, just a couple quotes to tie into what you said, and that's from William Shakespeare. Being born is like being kidnapped and then sold into slavery. There's another one, Frederick Douglass. I like this quote because he's someone that actually experienced it, first-hand observation. He says, I have observed this in my experience of slavery, that whenever my condition was improved, instead of it increasing my contentment, it only increased my desire to be free, and set me thinking of plans to gain my freedom. I have found that to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and, as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man. And I think that's a beautiful quote. I think it beautifully illustrates the idea I was saying about how our morality is, or really the chains, our lack of morality are the chains that we have, and that it's really just in knowledge and information and wisdom of seeing the situation that we're in that we can then make any real progress. But I think that for that progress to be made, we do need to really understand the role that the culture we live in is. I mean, those are the chains, and that's the noose that we're hanging by right now with slavery. And back to the end of all evil. Chapter 4, one more. This is my final rant on the culture. It says, cultures are created to protect power structures. Culture is the enforcer of authority. Culture distorts principles in order to defend the authority of evil. Culture must convince you that it is not wrong when law subjugates your worth and destroys your freedom. Culture convinces people of this by perverting the concept of morality. Because morality is liberty. Immorality is evil. The exercise and defense of freedom are moral. The destruction of freedom is immoral. This is the truth of morality. Prudence is the proper application of principle. Imprudence is foolishness. Prudence is not morality. It is not immoral to kick a heavy stone with your bare foot, but it would probably be foolish. Prudence is a question of applying the principles and wisdom you have gathered in your life to achieve the goals you have for yourself. This is made possible by liberty. Without liberty, prudence is meaningless. Morality must come before prudence, and the great lie of culture is that authority is not bound by morality, and that authority can enforce its own prudence upon you. The great lie of culture is that you are worth less than law. Culture teach that intentions of prudence can be enforced by law. In this fashion, they gain excuse to control the lives of people, and in order for people to learn, grow, find happiness, people must be free to test their understandings of principles
Is that
given to those by seeking legitimacy in political arguments. Culture teaches that good people are those who allow themselves to be extorted and controlled without thinking.
Right. So the this debt slavery we were talking about and what we're facing today. There's a movement that's kind of come out that's called the free man movement, and there's it's a pretty fringe thing. I've run into some of these people, and I got to tell you, they make 9/11 truthers seem like the tea and crumpet crowd. I mean, they're very, very aggressive, and it's like Max Egan, a friend of mine. He's got this whole thing. He's saying, they get a little bit of information and they go running off half-cocked. And so basically, the free man movement is this group of people that think that they can outwit the corporate structure by basically renouncing their citizenship. You don't get a driver's license, you don't register your car, you don't get insurance, you don't have any identification. And so, there's people that do this, and then they're pulled over, and then they, assert their rights, and they have this whole rap and routine that they give. I challenge you to show proof of claim, and they have this language, and it's really complicated. And again, it's all part of maritime admiralty law, which is a whole other show we could get into. But it's the kind of law that they use to control people. And it's the law of the ocean, of offshore, whatever. So this is how to supposedly navigate that. Well, there's people who say that it's valid. There's people who say there isn't. Well, I think it's valid, and I'll tell you why. There is something to this. Then there's got to be a solution in trying to understand the legalese of this. I mean, this is the reason why there are lawyers on the planet, is to understand this language. This is the language of business. I mean, it's their only function. And so they can read this language and they can speak this language, ergo they are instruments of, that's why they're officers of the court. And the court is, where this actual kind of law is held. But the Homeland Security, FBI, they lists the Freeman movement on the list of potential domestic terrorists, okay? And so why would they put a group on a list of potential domestic terrorists if they weren't an actual threat, if what they were saying wasn't valid somehow? By the way, people who advocate for immigration reform, 9/11 truthers, people who talk about the Federal Reserve, people who talk about geoengineering, they're also considered potential domestic terrorists. Let's talk about freedom in America. There's a lot of people that say we still live in the freest society on the planet. That's not true. And people who say that haven't traveled. They haven't gone outside this country and seen how free, more free half the world is. We have the most people in prison of any other country in the world. We have an epidemic of police brutality going on. We have more violence than any civilized nation, right? And we still call ourselves free. We think we're free because why? Because we have the freedom to spend. There's this great Richard Pryor joke. And when he went to Africa for the first time, and he's talking to these brothers out on the Serengeti, and this one dude says, I want to go to America. In America, you can eat 24 hours a day. And Richard Pryor says, yeah, you can eat 24 hours a day. If you got money or a pistol, you can eat whenever you want. And that really underscores how our whole system works. You have freedom so long as you have money. A homeless person has no rights in this country. It is illegal for them to even sleep on a park bench. They spend their days going in and out of the county jails now because there's no mental hospitals, because they closed those down because nobody wanted to pay for those. And so we don't take care of the vets and the people that end up there because we don't have any mental health services. And now they end up on the streets. Try to go sleep on the street. Look at all the people who try to live off the land now. They're ending up in court. They're ending up in court for saying, I don't want to have an address. I don't want to have a driver's license. I want to hunt and live off the land. You cannot do that. It's illegal.
Yeah, you have to have actual identification these days,
You
too.
must have identification. You must have an address. You must have all of these things. Well, that eliminates a huge chunk of the population from being able to do that because some people can't get employed. They can't buy a house. They can't have an address.
Freedom is a facade.
And so there's a lot of people out there who think, okay, well, in the 60s, Abbie Hoffman in Steal This Book and all that, he said be an outlaw. And Steal This Book was how to be an outlaw. And, he said sell drugs and, run guns and do this. Well, that shit doesn't fly anymore. Because you try to participate in the drug economy, and what you're doing is participating in a black market where people are getting killed, where prices are being inflated, and where an entire economy is being propped up by the inflated costs of a black market that could collapse at any time and put almost everybody we know out of business and out of their homes. So, you can't run away from it. You can't get into the black market to get away from it because you're just a slave to the black market. So what is freedom, And
like I said, freedom is that ability to express your unlimited worth and value. And that's actually part of the issue, too, is that I think people have a very skewed version of freedom. In America, people have kind of confused freedom, what freedom really means, to being freedom is the ability to do whatever I want to do. That's not freedom. That's reckless, immoral activity. Just to do whatever you want to do and cause all the harm you want, regardless of the consequences. What we have, we're free to act without an understanding of the consequences of our actions. They give us that freedom for sure. We're very free to do that. We're very encouraged to behave in reckless ways that hurt other people without any understanding of the damage that we're doing. They give us that freedom because that's a freedom that also underlines our immorality. And like I said, the more immoral we are, the more we do. I think the dark side of this is when we act immoral, we deserve slavery. And that's a very uncomfortable idea for people, that we'd like to get up on a high horse and see where we're at. But if you're not acting and if we're not living moral ways, if we're exploiting people around us, you deserve exactly what you get. And I believe that this culture is designed in a way that continuously erodes our own morality. So we have actually no justification to live the freedom that I believe inherently we all deserve.
That's right. And even in a country that we think is free, it's only free for certain people. A lot of people don't understand that during World War II, we interred over 200,000 Japanese Americans.
Mm-hmm. Right here in Oregon.
There wasn't a single evidence that any of them were involved in any insurrection, any type of revolutionary activity, but we took them all and put them in concentration camps.
Just in case.
And then we kept that policy. In 1950, we passed the Emergency Detention Act. And that was a list, which still exists to this day, which I am on this list, by the way, of political dissidents that are to be rounded up in the event of a national emergency or a war. This was originally for communists. Then it became, at the height of the Vietnam War, 40% of the work the FBI was doing was suppressing protest and dissident action. Student groups, black nationalists, peace activists, they spent 40% of their time and government resources repressing the march for peace and freedom. And that's how all of those people, many of whom are my friends, ended up on the security index. That's what they called it when they found out that they had this emergency detention list. And so the security index then has morphed into many different names, and it exists now. It's got a black list and purportedly a red list. A red list is purportedly people to be executed in the event of martial law. This is a documented thing, so this isn't speculation. And all of the talk you hear about FEMA camps and all of these Rex 84, all of this stuff is real. It actually, these were contingency plans that do exist. So certain people, if you believe in certain things in this country, you truly aren't free. In 1 second, you could be rounded up and put into a camp simply because your government decides to go to war with another government that you feel you might be sympathetic with. Now, that is not freedom. I'm sorry, but under no circumstances does that sound like freedom to me.
No, we're free to believe a lie.
Yeah. So one of our listeners, Tyrotera, she asks, okay, so, you guys are doing really well describing the problem, but, you have a sense of what's wrong. What is the relationship with ourselves and our society and slave conditioning? What is the root of this control mechanism? I'm curious how you see a free and peaceful society, or at least what your intuition feels like. What is our goal here?
Collaboration.
Go on, Mike.
I think that's, I've been thinking about this while we've been sitting here. I think that in our modern day and age, we spent a lot of time talking about the history of slavery, like the Django Unchained kind of slavery, and none of us are experiencing, or anyone that's listening right now, we're not experiencing someone yelling at us, whipping us, beating us into doing our job. We're waking up by the alarm clock and we're going there every day. It's like we're willingly a part of this system because we need to be. We're a portion of it. But the thing is I think it all comes down to us finding value in our individuality, that we're not all created equal, and that collaborating amongst each other creates a different attitude toward the things we're doing. And slavery is an attitude adjustment, If we think that we're a slave to going to work, then you're a slave. Yeah. But if your attitude is, I get to go to work today because I get to go earn some money to put some food on my plate and, this roof over my head, I can afford to drive this car because I have this job. May not be the job I wished that I had. It may not even be something that I think is betterment for the whole society. However, if you can swallow it and do it every day, are you a slave or are you just contributing?
Yeah, and I think a lot in this. I think we can focus the rest of the show really on the solution aspect, because obviously the problem is huge and it's vast and it's very, very scary. One of the solutions that I see for myself is just it really comes down to partly just taking responsibility. One of the reasons that it'd be so difficult for us to all cast off the shackles of slavery tomorrow is that we are dependent upon the slave masters and the allowances they have for us. I'm an electromineralist artist. I'm dependent at the moment. Actually, I'm not. I'm partly dependent on a power grid. I don't grow. If I don't grow my own food, I'm dependent on someone else growing it. So it's going to take a radical act of people to become more responsible for themselves. I'm building a solar panel array on the farm because I don't want that dependence. I don't want the electricity that makes my art to be part of this system. If I can get it from the sun, if I can get it from technology, then that's something that I would want to do. Growing your own food, becoming, and everyone doesn't have to grow their own food, but reaching out, creating more communities around you where, I like what you said about, we're not all created equal. We're not. Taking advantage of the skills that other people have to collaborate in more community means, and that kind of goes into the in the principles of anarchism. It's about these less one ruler and more smaller self-governing states. And because in a world like that where we're governed in smaller areas, it's like Massachusetts is never going to launch an attack on Syria. It's like no individual, nobody agrees to war. Nobody wants to go to war. It's this arbitration by larger powers that be that give us our power and our food and our entertainment and our dark Miley Cyrus and Katy Perry occult rituals at the Grammy Awards. It's this whole system that we're part of, that we play into, that allows this to happen. That we are, unfortunately, we are the slave owners. We are the ones that are encouraging this. We're the ones that are supporting this and willingly conceding to this happening. But it's something that it's going to take a shift. But the cure is information. The cure is truth. the cure is knowledge. We thought the world was flat. Then when it wasn't flat. We thought, when the Declaration of Independence was made, we had slaves. But then after a while, we realized, oh, wow, that's intolerable. I believe that humanity has the ability to see and learn from its mistakes. Without these mistakes, we wouldn't have the triumphs. And life is a small series of different degrees of failure to achieve anything worthwhile. And when Ken talks about, because I talked to Ken, I'm like, one of my questions I asked Ken was like, what do we do? Like, how do we get out of the matrix? Like, what do we do? Like, how are we going to do this? And and this is up for debate, but he talks about kind of the 10% rule, that when you look throughout history, all the major sort of epochs in human progress, it started with 10% of people coming to this realization, and it would filter down through the consciousness, and people would rise up. And he estimates that we're at about 4% right now, 3 to 4%, yeah. And it's possible that within the next 10 years we could get to that 10%. I think what we need to understand is that as dismal and as dark as it is right now, as powerful as these control structures are, is that they are not natural. We need an understanding of nature. Nature will not allow this to replicate itself in perpetuity. It just simply won't. We need to understand natural law. We need to understand morality. We need to have a deep understanding of core human principles to treat other people like we want to be treated, because in the end, it's bound to fail. Slavery will not go into infinity. It will have a lifetime. And how this transition is made, how it comes across, how violent it is, how uncomfortable it is, how amazing it is, will come down to each and every one of us making that decision. But part of this show is, I think, the first step. It's like crossing an entire desert. We got to cross it with one step at a time. The first step is just to acknowledge that we are slaves. That slavery is very much alive. It's more sophisticated than it's ever been in the history of the planet. And until we can take a real accountability for not only that it exists, but that we're part of it, then and only then will we be able to make those first steps towards our pure liberation and towards our freedom. And like I said before, it's that the stakes are so high. The stakes are unbelievably high right now. And where we are is a place of slavery. The current trajectory is only more oppression. With the power of technology, it's almost unlimited the amount of control that they're having over us. But what's really at stake is a planet of 6 to 7 billion people. We see it as right now we're misled to the idea that 7 billion people on the planet is a liability. We're taught this overpopulation and what are we going to do in war and terror and financial collapse. If you had 7 billion people on the planet living in freedom, living in full acknowledgement of their worth and value, working in a collaborative way, the paradise that's possible is, it's inconceivable.
Yeah, but there's simple things we can do too. And one of the things you can do out there is stay out of debt. Cut up the credit cards, stop borrowing money, and start finding financial independence. Move to some place that isn't dependent on somebody else's water, somebody else's job creation, somebody else's food. There's little steps that people can take, mostly to stay out of debt, mostly to keep themselves clear. Now, here's the thing. There's going to have to be some kind of revolution. People don't like that word. That's too bad. It's the right word. It's just how you enact it. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian philosopher and dissident, he's mentioned in Cloud Atlas too. Sunmi, studies his work. And, one of the things that he had said was, it was only 4 months after the Russian Revolution, which was a revolution to liberate the workers from the oppression of the Tsar and the imperial Russian system. It was only 4 months later that the communists turned on the same workers and started wiping them out. They crushed them, they put everyone in concentration camps, they starved them, and they murdered them through pogroms. They estimate that the death toll is 60 million people died because of the Russian Revolution and communism. And that was a revolution meant to free us. We can't free ourselves through ideology. We can't free ourselves through a system. It has to be a true liberation. And the way that we liberate ourselves is through the heart.
Yep.
So that's pretty much it for us tonight. We want to thank you guys for coming out and listening to us. Our third show here on the Midnight Sunrise, coming to you live from the studios here at KMHD Portland. Our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we are bound to others, past and present. And by each crime and every kindness, we birth our future.
Free your mind and the rest will follow.